Over the last 3 weeks, we've examined some of the different ways cross dressing shows up in African cultures. We started with the definition of the phenomenon and then highlighted just how much of a normal part of community and ceremonial life it has been historically on the African continent. And the emphasis so far has been on untangling cross dressing from the misconceptions people have about the practice and its intersection with gender identity and sexual orientation. And if you need a reminder about these misconceptions, here goes. People who cross dress are usually comfortable with their assigned sex and do not wish to change it. Cross dressing is a form of gender expression and is not necessarily tied to erotic activity or indicative of sexual orientation. Yet there is the reality that to some people, cross dressing is a form of gender expression which allows them to express a gender different from what is associated with their biological sex. And this does include a sexual component. That is, their cross dressing is an expression of sexual orientation and even sexual availability. So, in today's episode, we will be examining the way this way of being shows up amongst African people because, yes, it does.
Hello, friends, and welcome to the Mythological Africans podcast, where we read and talk about stories from African mythology and folklore. I am your host, Helen Tunde.
We'll start the episode with a content warning. Our discussion today will meander into relatively explicit sexual territory, so I do not recommend this episode for listeners under legal age in any place where this podcast is available. That being said, I think it's safe to say that the biggest problem many people on the African continent and even around the world have with cross dressing people, men in particular, has to do with the assumptions they make about their sexual orientation and their intentions of cross dressing in each particular instance. That being said, it would be completely disingenuous for me or anyone else to act as if people who cross dress do not sometimes do this because they are transgender and or are looking to attract sexual attention. The question, however, is this. Have these ways of being always existed on the African continent, or were they brought about by contact with global culture in general and Western culture in particular? The first thing I'll say here is that gender dysphoria, that feeling of disconnection, discomfort, or distress, which underlies some individuals' inclination to identify as a gender other than what aligns with their biological sex, does occur amongst African people. That's not even up for debate. But gender dysphoria does not always underlie the inclination to be transgender or to cross-dress. And some individuals, and Africans feature amongst them, feel a sense of disconnection to either of the gender binary, and others, through self-reflection, social outside factors, or even just communication with and exposure to others within their community, embrace the freedom from conformity to any particular gender. As Audrey Mbugua, a transgender Kenyan, puts it, it's not a mental illness, but an incongruence of anatomical sex and psychological sex. There is a link in the episode notes with a great discussion about the link between gender dysphoria and transgenderism, as well as a video clip of Audrey Mbugua talking about her life. What's more, even the most casual examination of evidence from recorded history, religious and cultural practices, mythology, folklore, will all tell you that the African continent has always been plugged into global culture through trade and migration. So what this means is there's never been a time when, for better or worse, beliefs and practices have not been coming to, from, or leaving the African continent for far off lands. So that's just not the point, right? And also, in many cases, European accounts of the kinds of communities and practices their explorers and missionaries and the like encountered amongst the quote unquote unexplored people of the African continent attest to the fact that amongst many African people, the attitude towards sex and gender identity was actually very liberal by our modern standards. And that is why their encounters with their moralistic ideals, of those times past, resulted in what some analysts have called the Western rhetoric of abomination on the African continent. And that carried over into colonial times and has really affected the perceptions that many Africans have about things, leading to a situation where many Africans ourselves look at some of our cultures, in a skewed way. So if you look at what's documented starting in the 1500s and 1600s or so, when European exploration really started ramping up on the African continent, again and again, from accounts about people from present day Angola to Senegal to Ethiopia to Kenya to Tanzania, South Africa, Namibia, Zambia, and Congo. And that's just like basically a circle from southwest through west, north, east, south, and central of the African continent. You will find reports about men who dress and live like or among women and have sex with men and sometimes with women. The thing is, they would either be described in the most derogatory ways at worst or with reserve and bewilderment at best. For example, this is one of the first examples in records that I personally ran into. British missionary Edwin Smith and Army officer Andrew Murray Dale, who wrote extensively about the Ila peoples of Zambia, mention an individual who was known as a Mwaami or prophet who, quote unquote, dressed always as a woman, did women's work such as plaiting baskets, and lived and slept amongst, but not with, the women. Stephen Murray and Will Roscoe, two American anthropologists who wrote the groundbreaking book, Boy, Wives, and Female Husbands Studies in African Homosexualities, note that, like the Mwaami of the Ila, other cross-dressing and presumably transgender individuals like the Gangaya Chibanda, who are cross-dressing and homosexual priests found among some peoples in the Congo Kingdom, the Daudu of Hausa land, and some Mashoga of Mombasa, Kenya, freely associated with women, mainly because they lacked or were assumed to lack heterosexual desire. So there are examples from across the continent. In other cases, during colonial times, many Southern African men who left their villages to work in mines easily adopted the practice of becoming wives to other men. And this meant they would dress and live as women doing domestic work and having sex with these men in exchange for statues, for gifts. And what's interesting is that, by many accounts, the ease with which these practices were taken on in the minds, that is, emerged from a pre-existing awareness of and relative comfort with, non-heterosexual identity amongst the people. And so what you find when you start looking at the evidence, whether you're looking at historical accounts from the 1500s and 1600s and 1700s, more recent colonial accounts, is that things were always happening. People were always behaving and living a certain way. But what tends to happen is that the way these things were talked about created a perception that they were not natural. But then that came from the Europeans who were examining these communities, not from the indigenous African ways of understanding how people could possibly be. So this is all serious scholarly works in big books and research papers. So are there examples in folklore? As it turns out, yes, there is. In Hausa lore, Daudu was a prince who, because of his quote-unquote deviant ways, was expelled from amongst his people. But then people who were like him followed him and they formed their own communities. And the Yandaudu, as these communities came to be called, are effeminate men, so men who act and behave and sometimes look like women. In some cases, take on women's names, dress and behave like women. And Yandaudu might be homosexual, but they are also bisexual, which means they experience sexual attraction to both men and women. But what is interesting is that in an analysis of Hausa proverbs and a poem about Yandaudu carried out by Aisha Umar Adamu, a doctoral student at Aminu Kano College of Islamic and Legal Studies in Kano, Nigeria, shows that it is well understood that while they are born as men, Daudu identify more as women, or some do, contrary to Hausa cultural and Islamic religious expectations. One of my favorite characters in North African folklore is the decidedly amoral Simoa Ben Abid from Kabyle folklore. And the Kabyle are an indigenous North African people found mostly in Algeria. Simoa's story is told in Einik Tem, or What He Has Done. And this is a folk tale from German ethnologist and archaeologist Leo Frobenius' collection of what he termed Black erotic folk tales. And the story goes that after Frobenius spent years among different African peoples studying and recording their cultures and folklore, he decided to specifically collect stories with sexual themes because he noticed that these stories existed, but then other Europeans were not doing so. And the entirety of Simoa's story is not an easy read since it meanders into territory too strong for public broadcast and which plays into negative stereotypes about queer people. But I want to read the first section so there is no mistake about the sort of things that happen or where people were aware of in certain communities. This is what is told of Simoa, the son of Abid. It is held to be true. It is said of Simoa, the son of Abid, that at 18 years of age, he was more handsome than any other man. Up to that age, he remained home. He was quite inexperienced and had no inkling of the inexhaustible potency of his sexual parts. But when Simoa was 18 years old, he said, "Now I am going to set out on my travels." Simoa Ben Abid therefore took leave of his village. He set out on his travels. On the first evening, when he was preparing to lie down to sleep at the wayside, he heard the sound of music. The music was coming from a town very close by. When Simoa realized this, he did not lie down but went into the town. He arrived in the town which was celebrating a festival. People were dancing. Simoa joined the dancers. All the others stopped dancing and stepped aside. No one in the town had ever before seen so comely a man dance so exquisitely. The girls giggled and nudged one another with their elbows. The young men whispered to each other, if only we could sleep with him. The old women said to themselves, if only we were not so old. Simoa went on dancing. Everybody shouted, do not stop, keep on dancing. Simoa said, then bring me an anklet for my foot. Bring me bracelets for my arms. Bring me a head ornament for my forehead. Bring me a chest ornament for my chest. Bring me women's garments made of silk. If you clothe me in all these things, I will dance a dance for you such as you have never seen before. The people brought him women's garments made of silk. They brought him ornaments for his chest, his forehead, his arms, his ankles. Simoa Ben Abid put on the clothes. He chose the most beautiful ornaments. The young women gazed at him. The old women came close to him and nudged him with their elbows. Simoa Ben Abid was more comely than any of the women who lived in that town. I am ready, Simoa Ben Abid called out. Now you must play my own tune. You must sing my own song. Sing. Simoa Ben Abid is running away. May God bless Simoa Ben Abid for that. The fiddlers fiddled, the drummers struck their tambourines, the people stood round in a ring singing. Simoa Ben Abid is running away. May God bless Simoa Ben Abid for that. Simoa Ben Abid is running away. May God bless Simoa Ben Abid for that. Simoa Ben Abid danced. Simoa danced to the right. Simoa danced to the left. Simoa danced. The women called out to him in a shrill voice. The young girls tapped their feet on the ground and pressed their hands together. The young wives pressed their legs together and their hands against their breasts. The old women waggled their buttocks. Everyone watched Simoa Ben Abid and sang, Simoa Ben Abid is running away. May God bless Simoa Ben Abid for that. Simoa danced. Simoa leapt in the air. Simoa went leaping through the streets and out into the bush. Simoa gathered up his dress and said to himself, "My running away has everyone's blessing. God grant that I can run fast enough to enable me to keep all these fine jewelry." The people ran after Simoa. They lost sight of him in the bush. The people said to one another, "If we cannot catch up with him on the open road, and while we are on the open road, and while we are still quite fresh, we cannot possibly do so in the bush." And so the people gave up their pursuit and went back into town. Simoa Ben Abid continued on his way. He arrived at another town. He walked through the streets. Everyone, men and women alike, looked at Simoa. All the men said, "Never have I seen such a beautiful woman." All the women said, "Never have I seen such a beautiful woman." Simoa walked through the town. It was raining. He felt cold, so he began to look for shelter. He came to a big house. Several girls of great beauty were looking out through a barred window in the house. The girls looked down at Simoa. Simoa looked up at the girls. Simoa stood there, and Simoa sat down at the doorsteps of the house. The house was that of the town caddy. After a while, the caddy came out of his house. The caddy saw Simoa Ben Abid sitting on his doorstep, clad in women's garments and richly betrothed. "Never before have I seen so beautiful a woman," the caddy said to himself. "What are you doing there? What is it you want, O young woman?" he asked. "Oh, caddy, I am a newlywed wife. I was married the day before yesterday. But yesterday my husband beat me, so I ran away. I do not want to stay with him, but yet I am ashamed to go home to my own parents." "Such being the case, O young woman," the caddy said, "we must ponder the matter. I will see if I can help you." To himself, however, the caddy said, "I would like to lie with this young woman." The caddy was too ashamed to say so out loud. "I have a wife and 7 daughters," he said to Simoa. "Are you willing to remain in my house as my maidservant to my wife and daughters?" "I am willing," Simoa said. "I will remain in your house as maidservant to your wife and daughters." "Follow me then. I will take you to my wife." The caddy led the way and Simoa followed behind him. The caddy took Simoa Ben Abid to his wife and said, "I have taken on this young woman to be a maidservant to my 7 daughters. Make sure that my daughters are kind to her, for this young wife has been unfortunate in her husband and is deserving of our pity." The caddy's wife said, "I will see to it that the young woman is given a kindly welcome." "Come with me," the caddy's wife said when the caddy left. "This is the way. I will take you to my daughter's room." The caddy's wife pressed Simoa's hand, saying, "Even though you are a woman, I nevertheless feel an urge to sleep with you. I have never been able to understand how men could lie with other men, but today I can sense how that is that one woman can have pleasure with another woman." So we'll stop the reading here because it goes on, and Simoa gets into all kinds of mischief, and the story just, escalates in all possible ways. And if you want to read that and other selections of such folk tales from African peoples, there is a link to the book in the episode notes when I mention it. So here we are again in different parts of the continent, opening the pot of what some people claim is absolutely not African culture and finding fufu and couscous and bushmeat. What is challenging about many of these accounts, however, is that they often involve poor teenage boys, which then feeds into the fear that these people are corrupting their youth and harming children, which is all fine and good, except sexual predation on young girls is just as an alarming an issue on the continent. But you will find people defending that as African culture. It makes you think, doesn't it? The bottom line, however, is that like people and other beings in the natural world, Africans do experience these different states of being, regardless of how they come about it. And I want to say here that asking the question of if XYZ is African really gives an indication, first of all, of how much we have internalized the idea that the African continent was this untouched, inert, and dare I say, morally neutral place before Europeans arrived. And it also shows the ways in which many of us buy into the idea of, Africans as a supposedly superhuman type being who were untouched by the normal variations in and vagaries of human existence before that terrible time when Europeans arrived and changed everything. And this is problematic. It's problematic, and that's putting it lightly, because what happens is that we are unable to situate our difficulties in the context of the common human struggle, which means we cut ourselves off from the relief offered by solutions which come about from productive mixing of global culture. A perfect case in point is how resistant many Africans can be to legislation aimed at protecting the rights of people in the LGBTQIA community, because we see it as Western interference, not as a necessary step towards protecting the human rights and dignity of our fellow Africans. So, once again, is there any evidence that cross dressing, either as a manifestation of transgender identity or means to attract sexual attention, is a part of historical, traditional African culture? The examples we've looked at here today, and this is a very small sampling of them, confirms that it is. And that, I think, is a cause of celebration for our full inclusion in the family of all sentient beings on this beautiful planet that we call home. We'll stop here for now. Thank you as always for listening, and we'll be back next week with more exploration of African mythology and folklore and what it means for us in modern times.